Thank you all for coming today. This is Michael Miller, who's visiting us from Virginia. Michael has been a great kind of collaborator with Duke over the years, a scholar and an archivist who's worked for many decades on the history of the Marine Corps and other military history, and just more broadly than on the history of the U.S. and Central America and the Caribbean.
Decades.
And close to retirement.
Yeah, April 1st.
Okay.
Chosen specific.
But has also, because of his position, and has kind of been aware for a long time of all the resources that are available in these libraries and archives that a lot of people who study the Caribbean actually have not tended to use, that have been resources known by people working on military history, but not so much people working in Haiti. And so, as some folks from the library know, he helped the library get this monograph of Haiti that some of my students are studying this semester down here and digitized. Has brought other things to show.
Oh, yes.
And we'll be talking to us, so first present a little bit about these kind of sources and his work, and then we'll have, kind of Q&A about
Sure.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, well, thanks. Glad to be here. Glad to see people with longer hair than Marines usually have. I want to go. That's where I work. I want to come back. Any veterans here? Anybody serve? Okay. Well, the first thing I want to—that's not you. That was the trick question. I didn't think I'd see all the hands up. But the point is, start off with a question for you. And is military history a real genre of historical field? I mean, what's the importance of that? Is it important? And why would I spend decades studying it? Obviously I do, but you come with a different perspective, which I treasure when I come here to talk to you, because I always get some good feedback. And is it important? So, while you ponder that, let's go into what I'm working on, which is War Plan Black and the Navy Marine Corps landings. So it's always a good time to get somebody when they're right in the middle of their writing or close to the end of it. So I've just finished my first rough draft of a volume 1 of a book about this. And War Plan Black, most people never heard of it. At the turn of the century, there was a color code for all kinds of war plans. Teddy Roosevelt era, going forward, Taft, and then Wilson. And war plan, and each color stood for a country, a potential enemy. So War Plan Black was for the Germans. War Plan Red were for the Brits. War Plan Green were for Mexico. War Plan Yellow was for Japan. So it was endless. I mean, military people plan for all these contingencies in case it should ever happen. But the important thing is, how does Germany and War Plan Black affect Haiti and the Caribbean, or Central America? And if you look at this, it's pretty amazing to see how many times we intervened in countries south of the border, and repeatedly. And for what purpose was that? Traditionally, and even the military historians talk about, we call these the banana wars, which is the United Fruit Company, and making sure that our American supply of bananas was never interrupted. Well, it's being facilitated, but economic war. So we would go in and we go out, and we go in and we go out, make sure these were uninterrupted. But there is more to it than that, and that's what I've been writing about for like the last 3 years, and that is the German war plan to attack America, which is developed as they saw America emerging after Spanish-American War as a rival. So just like we had War Plan Black for them, they had a war plan for us to come across the North Atlantic and attack New York. And because of the circumference of the globe, that's the most direct route to come across. The problem was the German war plan was made with coal ships, so they had to have 60 ships of coal just to supply that fleet, just to get them across the Atlantic. So they came up with a separate plan, phase 2, where they would come down and resupply the Canary Islands. They established a coaling station, and from that point, what is the closest place to get across to attack America? And of course, it's the West Indies. And what's laying right in the path of that arrow? Culebra, Puerto Rico, Dominican, and Haiti. So their thought is, just much like the British in War of 1812, where they established a base, they had one at Nassau, and they raided up and burned our capital and so forth, but they had to have a base to do it. They couldn't come straight across. So the Germans sort of took that in their way. So my point is, it started to explain, unfold a lot of things about Caribbean history, is why things happen that way. Why did we intervene? So what was our response going to be? And this is one of the intelligence documents I found at the Naval War College from 1907, I think it is, about the German fleet and what their plans were for their maneuvers. So we were tracking everything they were doing and trying to build them battleship for battleship. So here's another one declassified. There's the Haiti San Domingo plan. See that? So we were actually planning to meet them in the Caribbean. We're going to go down from the East Coast, and we're going to establish a base, a forward base in Guantanamo. Yes?
This is 10 years before war was declared.
Oh, this begins, the first mention of War Plan Black is in 1901.
So it's many, many years, and America was not a presence in Europe at that time, was it?
No, we weren't a threat to them.
Why were the Germans so afraid of America? That was years and years and years before the First World War.
Well, because the Germans are surrounded in a landlocked country. They're looking for land and a presence around the world to rival. Their biggest rival is Britain. Not necessarily the United States, but they can't tangle with Britain, so they're going to fight with us over here, because we talk about economic warfare. The Germans are waging it as well. They have colony societies to send out their immigrants to come over and land in Central America and the Caribbean, particularly in Haiti.
I mean, it is worth just that the Navy, the expansion of coal-fired ships.
Yes.
And so every Navy on the planet suddenly needs to worry about how they're going to restock instead of using wind, using coal. And that's, I mean, I think the Caribbean really gets transformed because of that, because these are ideal locations for stopping both the U.S. and the German, and to some extent the British. But of course, the U.S., it seems to me the U.S. and Germany are competing because neither of them have their own colonies, whereas the British and the French have their own islands all over the place that they stop at. So both, they're both competing a little bit for some of the same terrain.
Yes, it's predicted by the world, and if you go back and read the intelligence reports from both sides, that they predict that America will fight Germany and they'll fight Japan as all those nations arise. So World War I and World War II is being predicted by the military intelligence back in the turn of the century after the Spanish-American War. So to make a long story short, though, what happens here is, why is Guantanamo there? Why is that base established? The Navy and leans on the President, Secretary of State, so when they sign the treaty with Cuba, the Cubans are forced to give up Guantanamo. And for what? It's not going to be a detention center for many years later. It's going to be the naval base they're going to use to fight off the Germans. And then here in Culebra, everybody ever been to Culebra? It's one of the most important points for the Marine Corps anyway, how they land and establish bases. So their forward base is going to be in Culebra, just off of Puerto Rico, and the main base is going to be here in Guantanamo. Okay, but what lies between them? Yeah. So you saw that Haiti Dominican plan. What they're going to do is launch and attack the Canary Islands before the Germans get there and destroy it. That's our plan, War Plan Black. So what you have to see here is the the money, because even though this is the war plan that helps explain it, it's still economic from both sides. But you can see that Germany is just way down here as far as its influence. But the important thing in Haiti is that Germans can go to these countries and they can buy land and so forth. But in Haiti, what must they do to own property? They have to marry Haitians. They have to become Haitians to own it. So they set up their businesses, and you know, it's theorized that they're the ones that actually are calling the shots as far as the presidents go, from president to president. Why so many turnover happens, it's because the Germans are picking out who they want to run the country. But here is the estimate by the War College, 1915. So World War I has already started. Going back to your question, we're still worrying about their total forces when they land, if they could land, Japan, Germany, and us. So, now, the other thing to think about is our foreign, just like now, is that the Navy, the War, the Army, and then the Secretary of State. Those are the three prongs of our foreign policy. So, going back to the study of military history, a lot of times we stovepipe ourselves. Military historians don't talk to the Caribbean historians or Latin Americans. The political historians don't talk to the military guys, but look at this from Woodrow Wilson's cabinet and compare that to recent presidents. And what does that tell you? Somebody didn't like him and what we were doing. So I'll leave that one to ponder at another time. But this, where do you see this? We hold Wilson up to here, but Wilson, you know, and before I get off my soapbox, Wilson has talked about these 14 points and how great he was with world democracy and all that. But where does it apply in Latin America and in the Caribbean? Does that apply? No. But we don't see that side of him. Here we sort of do. Here's some of the documents that we have, and they're endless. I mean, the military collects thousands of these pages. But it's interesting here, and this is 16, I think, is the reports that are going back. It says, you know, they cannot, we cannot win unless the people are in sympathy with the government, like Iraq. And so, you know, what do we have to do to find out? So he's going to see what the general feelings of the Haitian people are and try to make this thing work in 1950. Now, it also generates a lot of this intelligence, landing of, you know, even though the Germans, once World War I started, the chances of the Germans coming across and invading America were just like this, and it's probably even less than that on their you know, radar. But we still have this paranoia of the Germans coming, and if you look at this, you'll see we have a report of a shipment of guns landing, and we have to intercept it. Here's some microfilm of an investigation of Haitians. The same thing goes on in the Dominican and Cuba, searching out German agents, trying to find them and root them out. So anyway, long story short, there's a wealth of material out there that gives you new interpretations of what's happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that perspective, most importantly, because, it's because it changes what happens after 1918.
Is there one that you want to go to?
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
We just do the ocean.
Okay.
The important thing is what happens after 1918 when if all of our policy is sort of dedicated to keeping the Germans out of the Caribbean, what happens when there's no Germans to worry about? After World War I, it changes. So the occupations that take place after that have a different flavor to them. Now, what are we doing now? And you start to see these long-term occupations of, you know, trying to restore, you know, nation building. So, you know, there's some new interpretations going on with this. that I think are going to be really groundbreaking because of the material that the military has that no one's seen, like that book. So one of the things I'm doing as I go through my work is to try to get some of this material back to the countries and its original state so they can see sort of what their history is. And I've been to Mexico and done that. I'm going to Nicaragua and send back some of their material. So that's what that book is about. Now there's even more, and I'm going to pass these around for you as we talk. The book was prepared by the Marines, but here are some of the materials that went into building the book. So these came from the fellows that did the book, and there's also the Senate investigations, the hearings. You can read the original testimony. And it's important to note that not every American was great with this. There was severe kickback from Americans saying, "What are we doing? What is this?" Particularly when the dead start coming back. So there is, so you see that reflected in these things as well, and some of the atrocities that took place. Yes.
So let me see if I understand what's happening here.
Yes.
There were political necessities up until 1918 for repeated invasions or occupations, or however you want to, by the U.S. government forces in various islands. After 1918, if I understand what you're saying, it shifted from political to economic because repeated occupations continue to occur even more frequently, or am I misunderstanding? It sounds like it became economic after that.
I have not gone to a great study after 1919, but I have a general knowledge of at least what the Marine Corps was doing in that period. And, it's almost like we're in there now because we occupied, Cuba, we occupied Haiti, Dominican. What are we going to do now? And so there wasn't a lot of thought what was going to happen when Germany was gone. We're still thinking about the Japanese on the west coast. By the way, they got a port on the west side of Mexico. But what do we do now? And then it seems to become a nation-building, longer occupation. And the results of that, were felt for years and years, all the way up to today, because once we left after long occupations, the people that arose that we supported became, against the people. So, that's where I see the trail going. And so there's this break before with the Germans, and then what do we do now? And it goes back to the point that when you go into a place to occupy, invade, for whatever reason, it's a lot easier to go in than it is to go out, as we see today. So when we go, you see on the slide with all those occupations, we would go in and we'd do our thing for 3 or 4 months and bang, we're gone. And then the people go back to doing what they do. That starts to change, and then you go to the American presidents and the foreign policy that's being done. The assistant secretary, if you noticed, of under Wilson was FDR, Secretary of the Navy, who essentially writes some of the constitutions of the countries in the Caribbean. So you see his hand going all the way up through into the 30s of his interest in the Caribbean and Latin America. So there's these strings to go through. I'll leave it to people like Laurent there who can talk more about that period than I can.
I mean, I do think there's like an original, the economic and strategic go together to some extent, because the strategic question of coal plants and the Americans actually already tried by the 1880s are interested in getting a harbor in Haiti and Mont Saint Nicolas, and they tried to do that and so forth. So there's that kind of strategic thing, but there's also an interest in companies going into the Caribbean and setting up sugar plantations and that kind of stuff. But I do think with the U.S. occupation of Haiti, they go in 1915 with a sort of, it's like there's a longer term plan, then it's triggered at a certain moment because of, to some extent, the worries of the German. And then they're there, there's actually basically no resistance when they come in to Haiti in 1915. But then once they're in, there's a kind of process whereby resistance starts to develop. And by 1918, 1919, there's a war, pretty serious war, which ramps up the deployments and kind of oddly gets the U.S. even more invested, and then having to kind of justify the presence in the wake of this war. And by the 1920s, it becomes a whole nother project where they're sort of doing public works in Haiti and have a basically almost like a colonial mission that lasts until 34. So it's interesting because I think we were discussing this earlier that it's not as, it's not planned out from the beginning, but then one thing kind of creates the conditions for the next. And the DR has a similar, it's not quite as long, but it's a 10-year occupation. So the whole island of Hispaniola, if you will, is occupied by
So by 1920s, were there significant economic interests that the United States had to propel further occupations by our Marines in these islands?
Yes, well, the economic motivation started earlier, which was that American investors were interested in sugar plantations in the area, and they built a lot of sugar plantations, notably in the DR, which are still American owned in many cases. So there was definitely an agricultural, an investment dimension, and these people who were magnates in industry did have a lot of connections with people in the State Department. This was a very tight, people were sort of talking to each other. So, I mean, one of the main things the U.S. government does is rewriting the Constitution of Haiti since 1804 had outlawed foreign whites from owning land because the country had been founded by slaves who overthrew a plantation regime. And so the U.S. does rewrite the Constitution to allow foreign whites to own land, obviously, so that there can be, this kind of investment. And as you said, the German merchants had come in throughout the 19th century, had often married into families. Too.
Right.
So, did you have?
Yeah, I think it's kind of related. Some of us were talking on Tuesday when we were in Rubenstein about like at the end of the day, what was the actual material benefit that the U.S. actually got from occupying Haiti? And I think listening to what you're saying right now, it's almost as if if we want to understand the occupation, that's probably not even a very useful question. More so of how was, I guess, back and forth. It's not really a great term, but how did when they got in and just the series of events maintain the occupation more so than an intentional plan of this is what we're going to get out of it.
Right. And it was, when you put the chart of the government, I mean, I always say this, that it's also important to understand that the American government is often incoherent itself, right? So that military, Navy, different parts of the military, the president, the State Department, all might have quite different visions and agendas that sometimes come together, so the president orders troops into. But when the president ordered troops into Haiti, there was no debate. There wasn't a congressional hearing. Then years later, by 1920, there's a big congressional hearing. This is just a part of it. You can pass it around.
Yes.
But so the Congress does take it up sort of retroactively. Why are we here? What should we be doing? And Haitian, these are very fascinating because Haitian witnesses travel up from Haiti and go to the Congress and testify about various things during the war. So,
Absolutely.
What was the war that you talked about? I'm ignorant of the war in 1908 or something.
So I guess 1918, and actually the question I wanted to ask you about what you have around that conflict, but 1918, starting in 1918, there's big rural uprisings against the Marine occupation by Haitians. So there's an insurrection, basically, or a revolution, triggered largely by the use of forced labor for road building. Is the particular trigger. So the Marine occupation determined that they need roads, and they actually invoke laws that are on the books in Haiti that allow people to use sort of local labor, but it gets much worse. And so that's the sort of trigger point. And then by 1918, there's a really serious campaign. I mean, it's a war that's never been, integrated into American memory as a real, one of our conflicts, and yet it was quite a significant campaign. So I don't know. I mean, if there's materials, because there are materials I know in the National Archives. Are there materials about that conflict in your collection?
Oh, very much. There's thousands of pages. And it's not only official, but it's also, you can also gain insight with the personal papers, the letters and diaries that these men kept as they went. And also just the ephemera, the things they collected, pictures of this. I mean, they were like tourists. And at that level of the privates and the townspeople, they got along well. And some of the Marines would take off for months and not come back.
So how do those materials get to you? Are those things that Marines donate or their families donate after they pass away? So these are like their personal things that they just came home with, is that right?
Right,
Okay.
exactly. So the official records eventually will go to the National Archives,
Okay.
That's why there was, the official records are mostly there. The personal records still remain with the Marine Corps in Quantico. And within those, all of the message traffic goes back and forth, takes place there. But to focus in a little more, to help you understand what happens in 15. So World War I starts in 14. So the first thing we think about is protecting the Caribbean, and so that helps explain, that was in 15 and 16. And in 17, when we actually go to war, I mean, we're basically at war in the Caribbean, and they're investigating people, and they're putting them in jail, and taking pictures of them. All these files are there with the FBI even to keep track of people because they're afraid the German U-boats will get a base in Haiti. And there's a big war plan that involves 3 or 4 divisions of Army troops that would go down and occupy both and basically take care of the coast because we were so afraid of. In reality, the Germans couldn't have done it, but sometimes I think the British were feeding us information for us to take care of that area so they wouldn't have to, because they're converting over from coal to oil now. And where is British oil coming from? A lot of it's coming from Tampico, so it's got to get through the Caribbean and go out. You can think about World War II when the U-boats do come, the massacre that takes place off the east coast of the United States and the Caribbean. So we sort of put ourselves into this situation where there's going to be a more prolonged, it sort of feeds on itself. We're there really to keep stability, so the Germans are out, and so our economic forces take place. But then as these things go on into years, I mean, think about if you were a Haitian or somebody from and these guys you're out working on the road, they're telling you what to do, the resentment builds. So by 1919, when, a lot of Marines want to go home, they're suddenly, there they are, and they stay.
So so in your collections, are there also just like the personal materials, letters that they kept? It's sort of interesting, right? Because what's said officially and what's said by Marines, personally is probably quite different, or maybe quite different.
It is.
About how they're interpreting this whole conflict.
Yeah, good social history could be written about things like that, about from the privates and the lower ranking officers who have dealt with the people every day. And you'll find that they've had a great respect for the beauty of the islands, where they were, and they'd write home about how beautiful it was, because most of the cases, these were Americans that were 19, 20 years old, just off the farm or from the city, and they're seeing something new for the first time. So their view of it is a lot different than the generals are, because the generals have these plans that are directing them. But these Americans don't have that.
Right.
So to them, it's just like, this is a vacation, it's a holiday, until the bullets start to fly. Yes?
I know I have a lot of questions, but when did the Panama Canal become operational? And did that cause a military imperative to keep our troops stationed there to protect the commerce that went through the Panama Canal?
They started in the end of 1912 to early 1913. And so the very first ship, I think, goes through the spring. But think about why the Panama Canal was built there, because, too bad it's off the screen, but one of them was military use, because then we could bring our fleet through to the East Coast to fight the Germans or to fight the Japanese going to the West Coast. And that's why the Marines were in Panama, all the way until it opened, and then it was taken over by the Army, who kept forces there until World War II.
And the Panama Canal itself is built on top of an earlier fact, which is actually a lot of the gold rush from America went through Panama. So rather than people going overland, it may even be a majority of the Americans who went to California took ships down here, overland, across Panama, and then ships on the other side up to California. So there had been, and I think the key here for Haiti, and all you have to do is look at this, and a boat that's going towards Panama always has to go between Haiti and Cuba. And on one side of that is Guantanamo Bay. The other side is Mole San Nicola, which I referred to earlier, was the base that the Americans have been trying to get for a long time. But from a strategic standpoint, I mean, you can see that whoever controls that little peninsula can basically either determine or open or shut down transit. So it's absolutely, it's like a Gibraltar. In fact, earlier the British had referred to Mole San Nicola as the Gibraltar of the Caribbean. So there's that kind of same sense, right, that this is a really vital location. Of course, then that's one of the things that they're looking at, especially the Navy is looking at.
Yeah.
Couldn't they go through, like Florida and Cuba? I mean, that route, did they have to go through?
It's just sort of from a currents and other kind of standpoint, that was the major, I wish we had,
Yeah, there, as you can see, it's directly here.
Oh,
And if
okay.
you go around, you have to, and then you go around.
Yeah, you have to go all the way, circumvent Cuba, and yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's but,
Yeah.
This is kind of a question more about politics, but what long-lasting effect, other than like the obvious, did occupations have in terms of like, because you mentioned that they rewrote parts of a sovereign country's constitution. So like, how do those reflect on like the testimonies and like hearings in Congress, things along those lines? Like, were those changes ever remade or redone to reflect like prior to the changes?
Right. That was never reversed, so they didn't ever go back to the provision on not having outs. Now they did then write new constitutions in Haiti after the U.S. occupation. And to be fair, the U.S. rewriting of the Constitution was mostly based on the Haitian Constitution with key provisions changed. But probably more important, and you had kind of mentioned this too, is both in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Haiti, they all do create new armies. So in some ways, the national armies of all these countries, in the modern sense, were created in relationship to the U.S. military occupation, in part because in each case, they didn't really have a very centralized army. So they kind of created so I mean, it's actually the history of the kind of modern Haitian military sort of does start with the U.S. military and training and so forth. And that's true in the Dominican Republic too. Trujillo was an officer in the U.S. So they recruit officers, and a number of those people then become part of the new political class, as you explained. The military leaders and officers who come up through. And Duvalier actually studied in an American school during the occupation and studied at the University of Michigan afterwards. So there's all these, there's definitely personal trajectories that you can see where the new kind of new political configuration emerges because of people who were part of the Arab occupation.
But everything is, if I can give you the best analysis, everything is connected. It's just everything seems to have a piece of something else attached to it. As we talked about, the military then evolves into the dictators, and it goes on to what we have now. We're continuing to go, but the important thing is military history is just part of that.
Right.
If you look at the involvement that take place at and it's not like it's an isolation, because the Haitians are watching what's happening to the Mexicans and how they deal with the Marines. And the Nicaraguans are watching the Mexicans. And you start to see, in 1900, there's really not many casualties when these occupations take place. The largest thing is that we go to China. There's a good extrapolation of what can happen when a bunch of greedy countries come to a country and just tear it apart. But here, they sort of get along, and okay, we'll play with these Marines for a while. But then, about in Cuba in 06 and 11, you start to see shots being fired back at them. And particularly Nicaragua in 1912, where there's 7 Marines killed. It's a pretty hard combat. And so when the Marines go ashore in Mexico, Veracruz in 14, is a pitched battle in the city. So the next year when they go to Haiti, it starts off pretty, but they're watching how do we deal with these Marines. And it's cool to see, and it's not all one way, because they figure out ways to deal with these Americans and still come out ahead, like how to play Americans off of each other, and how to play the Marines off, and how to appeal to the constituents in the United States. But there's a strong faction of Americans who opposed all of this. So this is a waste. Why are we doing this to people? What's the point? And this bodies come back. There's millions of people. I swear, millions that welcome the bodies as they come home. So it's not all imperialist America going in. There's all these things that are interconnected that won't show it. So
I'll just pass this around, so this is a book called Occupy Haiti, which was done by a group called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, a women's organization in America, that then went to Haiti and kind of documented the occupation and wrote this critical book about it. And African-American activist James Weldon Johnson was the most famous, wrote a series of essays on.
explain that one. That's a pretty.
So this I'll pass around too. This is just interesting. It's written in 1915. It's actually just a history of Haiti written by a Haitian for elementary school, so kind of narrating their own history, which I hadn't seen before. It's really
But the connection is the Marines brought that back to help study Haiti.
right. So they use this as the
They used the grade school textbook as help build.
Oh, I see. So it's in your library because the Marines kind of brought it back.
Every one of these
Yeah.
books were kept by those Marines as they studied Haiti.
I see. So that's kind of what you were saying too, that this was the material, the kind of material that they used for the monograph of Haiti, which is this document that's in the library here, an original, I mean, not a book, but a
Yeah.
kind of manuscript in a way.
Yes.
So they were using these materials to write a certain amount of that. Yeah.
I guess my question going off of that is how much of the material that we have here that is in like the military history is written from the viewpoint of either Haitians, whether that be military people or actual people from Haiti during the time, because even though the Americans benefited, a lot of times it seems, as usual, that it's like a big ego war after time and that they're really not there to benefit people. And so it would be very interesting to see, of course, the Marines might bring back that book, but probably because it painted them in a pretty good light. They're not going to talk about like how they pretty much made people slaves while they were there. So how much of that also gets incorporated to?
Well, the important thing, and that's what I always say, is you don't have all of the story until you look at both sides of a battle or any kind of incident that takes place. So very little of Haitian accounts, very few Mexican, very few Cuban survive. Very few. So what you're seeing is the Marine point of view. In the personal letters, you'd be surprised at some of the comments that are made by the Marines. I mean, they're just like we are. There's one officer after the occupation of Veracruz, and he writes home to his parents. He said, "I'm embarrassed. I don't know why we're here. This is worthless. We need to go home." So not every one of them says that, but you'll find pieces like that. They're saying, "What are we doing here?" Because they're just like we are. And then others will be, "Hey, we go to town and we drink and we have fun and those kind of things." But it's just all the right variety. But we are missing the accounts from Haiti.
And it's true that Roger Gaillard, who's the great Haitian historian who wrote about the occupation, found that and did a lot of oral interviews. So the reason that his work is so important, he went and interviewed all these people in Haiti, which was one of the few ways to get the. It's true that in this what Edwin has back there, which is the congressional testimony, you do have a lot of Haitians who came to Congress to give their opinions, like anti-occupation activists, I mean. And so, or priests or others. So there are materials in there where it's like a first-person account that was, testifying in Congress, which is really interesting if you think about it. So they were kind of traveling to Washington and saying, no, this is what's really going on. So that's a pretty interesting document.
And the other thing is, what happened to them after they suffer because they came here to testify? I don't know. But the other thing is that I've been to Veracruz and in touch with their historians and their people and putting together our accounts with their accounts. And it's a fascinating thing to see how we impact a country and what our history says and what their history says, matching that up. It's like the Native Americans and the cavalry. It's for them, for Mexico, one of their greatest military achievements was the defense of Veracruz against the Americans. It's like their Pearl Harbor Day.
Right.
They celebrated every president comes down to make speeches. They do, it's a national pride. They stood up to the Americans, and Well, I wasn't anticipating. I thought they'd be, the Americans came in, they'd be more angry with us than they are, but it became for them a national, a way to put their country together, nationalist pride. I don't know if that occurred in Haiti or not, I don't know.
Well, no, Greg, I mean, so in Haiti today, the resistance of the Cacos, even though they were defeated, is definitely celebrated and remembered, so there's that kind of cultivation of that history as the people who, unlike the government, because the Haitian government basically acceded to the occupation.
Yeah.
There were many collaborators, so there was that problem too, right? Yeah, Sachin here, sorry.
So I kind of have a two-part question involving this German war plane right here. So first of all, how credible was this threat? I know you said obviously it's a tiny threat because I thought that by 1917 wasn't Germany fully blockaded and they were undergoing all that stuff. So by the time that they invaded Haiti, which was the early, it was not that many years before the beginning of the war. How credible was this actual plan of attack for Germany? Because if they did beat the British Navy, then what chance could the American Navy really stand at that point?
The only time it was credible,
Uh-huh.
and even for the German, to the Kaiser, was prior to 1909. And after that, the German army said, we're going to lose all our men, and it's a total waste of effort. So they moved that down off of their top list of things to do to the bottom. And it continued to be there through World War I. But the problem was that we still believed it. It's almost this paranoia of Germans, and the Haitians would play off of it, the Cubans would, some of the reports that I showed you, the questioning the intelligence, they were, we saw a German sub. And we saw, we saw some arms coming ashore with Germans, we heard them speaking German, and things like that. So, and then there were even reports of German U-boats off the coast of Mexico setting up a base. And you see the traffic just flies because we have this paranoia about it. And so the only time we really almost came to war over this was in Venezuela in 1902 and 03 when the Germans and British teamed up to make Venezuela pay back the loans that they had given. And so they actually bombarded and killed some of the Venezuelans. And so, and Roosevelt almost had our fleet, which was here in Culebra, ready to go down and start, basically gave an ultimatum, get your ships out or we're going to go down and pound you, which we had the advantage at that point. And then the Germans backed away. That's the only time that actually could have really come to blows.
That vital strait that you pointed out of passage, on the island of Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic faces east. That logically, I would think, would be where most of the interventions, the Marine Corps interventions would occur, because that borders the strait, whereas Haiti is on the other side of
It's actually
Hispaniola.
flipped. It's the other way around, sorry. Haiti is what borders the strait.
The Dominican Republic is to the left of it?
It's on, yeah. So that's Haiti and this is the DR.
Yeah.
So, but both were occupied anyway, so the DR was also occupied.
Just 1 year apart.
But Dominican Republic is to the east of Haiti, is it?
Yeah.
But the strait was to the west of
Yeah, exactly.
Haiti.
The strait is this. So this is Cuba, that's Haiti, and that's the Dominican Republic. I know it's a bit small.
And the strait was this.
And this is the kind of key. But both sides of the island were occupied, and in fact the resistance often, this is part that's Dominicans and Haitians sometimes forget, but Dominicans and Haitians kind of were conjoined. They both had groups and they kind of traded across. So the central region was a heartland for the resistance against both sides.
But the strait had an advantage. The deep water.
Right.
It's very deep water. Even the port they were building now in Miami cannot compare to the water. It's so deep.
Right.
And that's also that's where Columbus in Mont Saint Nicolas, that's where they staged their first camp, not in the north from occupation. They went after that. But in the beginning, that when they discovered it, when they entered Haiti, that's where they stayed in that wing, because that give you that push the boat all by themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and if you look at winds and currents across the Atlantic, you'll see this sort of every time that they really do, they hit here, you know? They kind of, this is why Columbus ended up there, or some hit there, but this is really like a landing spot from the earliest days of sail, you know, until, so, but I guess, you know, I was going to say that it was important to know that the German warships and British warships and American warships were constantly patrolling the Caribbean. I mean, there was a huge amount of traffic. The Germans constantly intervened in Haiti if the government, you know, wasn't paying a debt, or if there had been an uprising and German merchants had lost property and they wanted. So there were pretty regular bombardments of Haitian towns by German ships. I mean, it's, you know, when you get into the history, you realize this was kind of almost always in a state of war with these different European. So it was not at all isolated. It was really at the heart of. I mean, because again, this was a strategically vital location for pretty much all of the, for a lot of the global powers, the Europeans and the U.S.
Right.
And the thing was that the United States was going into that mode of becoming a global power, and the Caribbean became the first site, right, where they were.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because if you look at that, that's a lot of money.
Right. And you can see Cuba is particularly vital.
Yeah, sugar and the mining. So the traffic is amazing. But prior to 1915, you know, what you said was perfectly accurate. They would bombard, they'd seize custom houses and then leave. So if you were Haitian, you know, hey, we'll put up with this and they'll go away. And then all of a sudden in 15, they stay.
Right. Yeah.
There'd be a big contrast with Puerto Rico, though, in the sense that the U.S. completely controlled that relatively small island as opposed to trying to control all of Cuba or, you know, Haiti, Dominican Republic was really a very different thing. I think that Mahan guy a little bit earlier thought that Puerto Rico was defensible and those other places were not so easy to defend.
Well, they put the forward base there. Puerto Rico. You know, and
That's the Columbia, right?
yeah, and Calabria right off of here. So they had a repair port because Calabria really, there's no fresh water on Calabria. So although it's the first point you'd hit, and that's where we would launch our attacks from, well, the really forward point was Puerto Rico. So which helps explain why Puerto Rico is part of the United States. And then Guantanamo would be the rear base that would be somewhat protected, where you could actually put ships in dry dock. So Mahan's exactly saying that, and that's why it's there, is this war plan black that they were talking about.
I mean, the interesting thing, right, is the interface between a U.S. strategy that isn't, it's different a little bit in each island, but it has a larger sweep, right? And then obviously each of these Caribbean societies is coming off, you know, 300 or 400 years of history that has shaped their attitude towards us in different ways. So each place has a really different reaction, which is kind of interesting. And that's what, it's partly then interesting to see the slow absorption of that fact that, you know, the fact that Haiti is the society it was that overthrew slavery and that had developed this strong, like, anti-plantation or counter-plantation rural culture meant that when the kind of way, what the reaction to Americans wanting to set up plantations, you know, takes on a different form than in Cuba, than in the DR. Each of these places, they're seeing everything through a particular lens, you know, and even if it's the same, roughly the same Marines with some of the same plan from Washington.
The book is so funny. They use that, the Marines actually use that to like learn about Haiti.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
That's the elementary,
Yeah,
the
no, it's
and
like
that was,
such a
so it's,
basic,
it's
like,
published
level of
in
language.
1915, so they
Yeah,
must have
wow.
gone in and just, this was like the most recent.
Yeah.
So,
And
there's-
then
oh,
you
yeah.
did a pass around the other
This,
thing.
actually, he wanted to
Yeah.
pass it around because this is sort of interesting as, this is a published book, but it's almost a little bit like the friendly version of the monograph of Haiti, like much less, but you can sort of see the same idea, like this is the towns and these are the countries, but without some of the sharper. I mean, what is interesting is that in the monograph, they're clearly saying, like, they say stuff like that, you know, Haitians that are worrisome that we have to keep an eye on, right? There's a surveillance aspect to it that this is not going to show, you know.
Right,
so.
this is the unclassified version
Yeah.
of the.
So. And then this is the actual report in 1929, I think after the student protest. So this is when by 1929, the Americans are trying to figure out how to get out, basically, or like, how do you unwind this, you know,
Like we had enough, we need to.
Yeah.
Did repeated interventions, I'll use that word, by our Marines through the years destabilize these countries, or did it act for a period of time to, even if it was a dictator, to stabilize the countries? What do you say?
I mean, I think, so in the case of Haiti and the DR, it's much more than intervention. I mean, if you really look at it, these were functionally like a colonial occupation, right? I mean, the Marines created an army, ran the government, we're all, right? So this was, it looks like a colonial occupation in many other, and it's not just a punctual. So it had, during that period, in a sense, was stable, like there wasn't much political upheaval, there wasn't a change of regimes because the regime was in the hands of the occupier. There was this big war in 1918, 1919, and then another mass protest in 29 against the occupation. But then the questions to ask is like, I mean, I'll just put it very simply, but most people think about these two occupations as pivotal in terms of the history of 20th century Haiti and the DR in terms of reconfiguring the political landscape and what happened afterwards. So, I mean, there's a lot of steps to that, but they certainly both, they kind of reconfigured what was happening in both those countries. And since both those countries in the 20th century have been pretty rough in terms of politics, there is a way in which, at least for most Haitian historians would see the U.S. occupation as having had very detrimental long-term impacts in terms of how the politics were restructured. And I think in the DR similarly, right? But a lot of that does really come from that second phase, which is like after the Marines are there and they try to transform Haiti according to an American image or what they think Haiti should be like, and that sets up resistance. And so that whole process is where it gets really interesting. So, yeah.
I was wondering, so one of the reasons that I guess was given for why we needed to go in or stay was that they owed us a significant amount in debt, and we were concerned about whether or not it would ever be paid off. And I don't remember if it was because of that or because also American investors owned the commercial bank in Haiti, right? We went in and confiscated,
the
stole,
gold, yeah.
I don't know, what they had in their treasury. Is that something that's ever been questioned since then? Or do we still have that gold?
Oh, the gold, that's a good question.
I know, it just seems like
there is, in my chapter I start with the Matias incident where Marines are sent in, this is before the occupations,
Yeah.
Marines are sent in, they just go and take the gold reserves of the National Bank and bring it to New York. Yeah, right. But it's a really good question. Did they ever bring it back?
I don't know.
Which I sort of doubt that they ever brought it back, but.
And it's just not,
Yeah,
I guess.
and that's part of a longer process by which, so it's like the American banks are, in parallel with the strategy, are moving into these areas, right? I mean, all these things are kind of happening at the same time. But of course, Haiti had been in debt for, the debt relationships with European and US countries stretch into the 19th century and are constantly part of the issue, right? And part of the justification too.
Yeah.
So, and even after the U.S. leaves, there's a position until the 40s of a financial advisor.
Right,
It's like
yeah.
it's sort of a small term, but it has an incredible amount of power. So there's an American representative who has a huge amount of power over Haitian budgets into the 40s.
Yeah.
So there, and this is, in some ways, of course, Haiti is not unique in terms of the whole relationship with debt for a lot of countries, but except that it's a much earlier history, it sort of starts in the 19th century. And so the U.S. is coming on top of about 70 years of debt to French banks, and they're kind of buying into the debt, basically. Interestingly, right? So, of course, the expenditure of occupying the country was also quite a lot, right? So, I don't know if we can figure out how much it cost, but clearly this was not an inexpensive proposition to send the Marines.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting.
Go ahead.
No, that's it.
Oh, okay.
Are they still in debt to us, you think, or to the U.S.?
Yeah.
I guess
Yes, there's
but,
still
is that
analysis
still
aid and, absolutely. The cycle of debts, 1825 to the present in Haiti, it's been pretty consistent. It's shifted but again, and that is not that's not unique to Haiti.
Right.
It's pretty widespread. But
Yeah.
Lita, do you remember what you were going to say?
Yes. I think the question too of stability versus instability is really interesting when you think about the effect of occupation, because at least reading your book, what it made it seem like was yes, there was a lot of instability for multiple reasons in Haiti, but that there was also a very huge, and still is, but very much there was a huge kind of like, there was like the national government, and then there was the way in which people actually lived every single day, and that those things were kind of separate, and that what occupation did was it kind of brought whatever, whether it was beneficial or negative, of like governance like right into people's faces in ways that, okay, yeah, like there was a lot of instability, but it wasn't necessarily
Didn't affect, right, yeah.
right. And so I think that that's interesting too, especially when you look at just colonial history in general, the ways in which intervention kind of like brings different forms of brutality like to people's front door in ways that it wasn't there before.
Yeah, I mean, I think this would be the way I would put it, is that the U.S. Marine occupation was much more efficient as a central power than the prior Haitian governments had been, right? Which isn't, I mean, they clearly were, like the new army was more efficient, they built roads in the countryside. The thing is that for many people, not having the central government in their face was exactly what they wanted, right? Now, those people had developed a way of living that was precisely predicated on not having intervention from the central government, on being free to cultivate, you know, their own networks and their own markets. And so, in a sense, what is from one perspective efficient, increasing in efficiency, is from other people an invasion, basically, right? Or like somebody that's now forcing, and in many ways doing what earlier Haitian governments had kind of wanted to do, just control the countryside, but hadn't been able to. You know, so there's a way in which I think that's where the rebellion really comes from. I'm sorry, I'm talking.
No, that's right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I thought about that too when I was reading about the way in which the Marines looked at voodoo and were trying to suddenly enact these laws that had been dormant basically for so long, and all of a sudden it was a problem for them, whereas in the past it really hadn't been causing that big of a deal. And so I agree with what she was saying about how they're almost creating instability that wasn't necessarily there before, at least not to the eyes of the local Haitians themselves.
Well, it's one thing for somebody to come from outside and tell you what to do, and maybe it's even better for you, but it's another thing if somebody, you know, like your neighbor, says, hey, let's do this or not. Just by nature, the Marines coming into a country to try and change everything and run it the way Americans would is, you know, eventually going to fail. Eventually it's going to fail. Because eventually they're going to go and it's going to be us again. And so that's why I find Haiti so interesting, as, you know, something different than the rest of the countries in Central America, Caribbean, the way they react to. And also, one of the Marines that commanded in Haiti, Smedley Butler, later goes rogue, and after he retires and writes a memoir, which War Was a Racket. That's what it was called.
Yeah, this is a guy with a great name, just Smedley Darlington Butler, a Quaker from Philadelphia. Is he still the most decorated Marine? Still the most decorated Marine in Marine Corps history. But he later writes a book called War Is a Racket that has this famous quote where he says, I thought I was fighting for America, but really I was just fighting for Wall Street. And really interesting character,
It
actually.
is.
Butler.
In his letters, I mean, I was one that.
Are there original letters?
Yeah, I went to his house in Pennsylvania and brought them all back, and sat at his desk, and those medals were right beside me, and talked to his son. So it was a fascinating experience. His letters are like Lee and Dow, as the Quaker.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in the testimonial book on the inquiry into occupations of Haiti and Santo Domingo, one is really interesting that some of the testimonies are in Spanish, and two, so this specific case is kind of like it was taken to the United States, and it's basically going off the idea that the people within the country were unfairly treated. So here, like the guy says that brute force has been imposed over justice or like the law. So I wonder, like, how
You just
far?
found that in there?
Yeah. How far?
It's full of.
Yeah. How far do these cases get? I mean, I haven't. It's kind of like daunting to read this whole thing, but
That's just the last third.
yeah. But like, yeah. I mean, in terms of like, yeah.
All digitized, don't worry, you can go online and read it.
Yeah.
But I just wonder, like, how far do these cases get? Like, to what point where so what point was the United States military like penalized for all?
Right. Not much, right? I mean, so part of the part of the thing here, and I don't know if you've studied this, is that it's the presidential politics come into this, right? Because Wilson's running for re-election, and so his opponents realize that he's very vulnerable in this, right? Wilson's like defender of small nations, League of Nations, but meanwhile in Haiti there's this war being prosecuted with atrocities being reported in the New York Times on the front page. What is right? So the presidential political campaign, they use Haiti as a kind of tool against Wilson, right? And then this congressional hearing comes in afterwards. But there's lots of, and you can see what's sort of striking. You can see the Dominicans and Haitians. Many of them had a very strong and positive opinion of the United States, developed over the 19th and 20th century, right? So that's they thought the U.S. was this amazing country. They admire the democratic institutions and so forth. So even by the 1920s, they kind of believe like, look, this must be a mistake in some ways. Like this is going on here, but if they knew, if they really knew what was going on, they would stop it. And so that's what you see. So people really believe in testifying. I mean, there are a few. I don't know if there are stuff. I mean, I feel like there were a few Marines who were maybe punished for
Very few, though.
certain accused atrocities. But by the Marine, was that like internal to the Marine Corps?
Internal to the Marine Corps.
Like court-martialed or?
Yeah, there's
Charges.
a list that says that the above named men will be tried for the military commission.
Okay.
Of which you are judge advocate.
So they send that to then these
Yeah.
military commissions, but then not much
Not much.
transpires?
But the
Yeah, it
point became, though, that now this wasn't going to be tolerated.
Right, so then it changes the,
So
okay.
changes the attitude of the Marines.
So
Okay, this happened, that will not happen again.
Right. So there's, what are you guys reading?
Oh no, like the
Four-
amount of like men being.
For like the thousands that were.
Right, it's not, yeah, but you're right, also it does shift the policy. Like then the kind of message goes down, like, this has been an embarrassment, right? And so,
All the way to the president's office, so.
Yeah, but it begs the question, like, what is that? Sorry. What is that? What is?
Digitized.
Like, what exactly does this book? What exactly does this book mean? I mean, 'cause, like, we're so down, like we're so down history that does this actually like mean anything in terms of like what it can do?
it's a good question. Have you been to a congressional hearing these days? Yeah. It's a really interesting question of like whether, I mean, I think what Mike is saying is it did affect things because subsequently these things did sort of stop within the occupation, right? So there's that. I think it's kind of amazing because you get all these voices of the, right? You see these different people playing out the different sides of it. So in that sense, at least for a historian, it's a really, but yeah, it does suggest, I mean, at the end of the day, I actually think it's in a way, it's interesting and important that the Congress did have those hearings, right?
Yeah.
Because one version you might say is why, the US government would just say, who cares, right? It's going on. So you can see here the dissension and the problem that this posed and the fact that there were very serious opposition in the United States to what was going on, including among elected officials, right, who carried out. Now, of course, other maybe forms of power were more powerful than the humanitarian opposition, right? What's interesting about this is how much, of course, this affected the African American activists or other activists in America who participated in this, who were in the process, and even this fellow Smedley Darlington Butler, right, who later decides that this is not truly American, or this is not what America should be, that we should. So, of course, the political ramifications maybe are down the road in a certain way, but.
Yeah, and it's important to note, as an archivist, that even if nothing happened, he didn't do anything, it's to record that person who spoke out, each individual that spoke out, and just think about coming from Haiti, going to the, Washington
Congress,
D.C.
yeah.
to Congress, and the statues, and just making that choice. It's important to document, because they tried. They tried.
Yeah, would you want to ask Victor?
Yeah, so I was thinking since we're talking about imperialist relations, it's important to talk about power dynamics. And I was just wondering if what the Haitians have recorded and their point of view had been recorded and read or distributed to other people, would power relations be different? Because I heard, I don't know if this is true, but I heard that Haiti had asked France for reparations because of the whole them having to pay France for their land. So I was
Yeah,
just
I mean,
wondering,
Haiti's asked for France to repay the reparations that France made them pay
Yeah.
200 years ago. Anyway, but yeah.
yeah, and whatever came out of that, did
Nothing, yeah. So, I mean, it's another case that Justin's, so in 2004, they asked, the story here is, right, I don't know if you want to tell the story. The story here is that in 1825, to get recognition, Haiti is forced, with gunboats, actually, the French send gunboats, they owe France 150 million in, they have to pay France 150 million in indemnity, which is basically going to the former slave owners for the property lost through the revolution, right? Sort of a crazy. I mean, well, for those of you who read the book, like I talked to this one Haitian sort of said we had to pay 3 times for our land, right? First as slaves, then in blood, and then we had to pay for it again, you know. But so, and that's why the debt starts, because they don't have the money to pay it. The French banks actually give them loans. I mean, literally, they're taking loans from French banks to pay the French government for having become independent. I know, kind of gives you. And that debt just, you know, so basically every year, and the Haitians were totally assiduous about paying their debt. They paid it every year into the 1880s, like very careful accounting. But of course, that's a bunch of money that's not going to build a school or, right, you know. So anyway, but in 2004, when that was brought up, and President Aristide actually asked for a very specific amount of money, it was kind of fun. It was like 168 million, and 37, you know, but based on the kind of accounting. But basically, the French government created a commission, and the commission said, well, you know, of course, this is really bad that this happened, but we can't really pay back money because that would be, how would you even do that, and what would that mean? So, and also we always give hate. And they cite. No, I know. They cited that they had given Haiti so much aid over the years, and that they would give more aid, and that was a kind of reparation. So you can read the report if you. Well, no, you can't. It's in French, but it's another case of. So these things have come up again. And you know, some of you maybe know that the CARICOM nations recently filed a case for slavery reparations against Europe. So. It's really interesting, right, that these kind of, it's the international dynamics and the whole history comes out again. What's interesting, of course, is that there hasn't, I mean, I don't know if you have thoughts about this or what people are talking about at the Marine Corps, but, you know, the beginning of the U.S. occupation of Haiti, which was 100 years ago this summer, basically slid through with, like, no public anything, right? Like, I mean, it's not like the government has never said, like, oh, maybe we should invade it, or there's been no kind of recognition or discussion, right? So it would be interesting to say that should there be some reckoning now, maybe not in the form of reparation, but just like at least a discussion between how did the U.S. occupation, but that hasn't come up. Yeah, or at least beyond this.
Teach it in high school.
Or just teach it. Yeah, just start with it.
I was not taught.
I mean, it's really interesting. It was hard. It was very difficult to find stuff in the media. There was a few things, but it's. You know, it's a fairly big deal that your country occupied a neighboring country for 20 years, like sort of not a minor feature. Right? So that's interesting too, like why, I mean, with France it's significant, but it's also, in a way, significant here too, right? That's why I think it's great that you brought up the gold. Because I never thought of, it's something I had never thought about that. I was like, did they send it back later? Like,
I mean, I'm sure they didn't, but like also, that would seem like a rallying point of like,
right, yeah, it's good, it's very
obvious.
obvious. I'll tell you an anecdote, which is, because I once was on a panel with this guy named Carl Braun, who is like one of the richest men in Haiti, and runs one of Haiti's banks. But just to give you a sense of where this sits with Haitians, and you know, you may think that a very wealthy Haitian banker would, I don't know, his politics might be different from mine or whatever, but it was so interesting because he started by saying, in 1914, the Matias came and stole our gold reserves, and this, like, he was really nationalist about this, right? So it was just interesting that there was a kind of sense that some of this is certainly some of this is very unsettled in Haiti and feels alive in a way that in America it doesn't, and maybe that's the privilege that America has, is to sort of forget about this thing that Haitians can't forget about because it happened, you know. Although what strikes me is that, of course, the Marines must not have forgotten about it. I mean, it was like, you know, an experience.
A few of us.
I mean, but those who served, I mean,
right. I mean, the Marines were lost. Their lives were lost. The families
people died.
Still suffer. I mean, but to that point, when I went to the 100th anniversary of Veracruz in 2014, they invited historians from around the world. And I was the only one there that wasn't from Mexico. So, you know, they were very kind. You know, it's kind of a tense situation. We invaded your country, and here I am. But the questions that were asked of me were very interesting, and most of them were very polite. There was one that said, "Are the Americans ever going to apologize?" Because this is huge for them. This is the biggest, one of the biggest things. It's like Valley Forge. So, I said, well, I'm going to answer this one first because this is right to the point. I said, most Americans won't apologize because they don't even remember this happened.
Mhm.
That's what a blip it is for Americans to know. That's one of the reasons I said, but I'm here to give you some sense that Americans do care.
Mhm.
And try to bring it up to that level, which is almost the purpose of my book, is all those countries that you saw there is what happened, what was that all about?
Mhm.
So,
There were two more, there was a few people out there. Can you? Sorry. Sorry.
I was just kind of going off of what everyone has been saying. I don't know how much of the monograph you've read since it's so big, but
I haven't read it all.
we've been looking at it for the past few days, and it's just like kind of unsettling to read something about the history of a country written by people that are not at all from that country. So I know, at least on the digitized version, when they're talking about the inhabitants, you can find the word lazy and you'll get over like 50 results. Like they're talking about how lazy the inhabitants are, or about the education, how people are so uneducated and the education system is so bad. So I was just wondering, like, your own personal opinion, like what is like the validity of this document, I guess, like for Americans or for the military, and then maybe, Laurent, I don't know if you can say like what value this document has to Haitians, if it has any at all.
Well, my personal opinion is that this document, there's several levels to it. Not only does it tell you about Nicaragua, Haiti, because there's also one in Nicaragua, but it also tells you what Americans thought.
Mhm.
So it's almost a window back on Americans and our view of the world.
Mhm.
And you picked up some of the things that were not the prettiest things for Americans, but that was commonplace. Because in those days it was a civilized world and there was everybody else. And some of the justification for invading countries was, well, we're going to bring about roads, and we're going to make the trains run on time and all those kind of things. So that was the prevalent idea. Not for everybody, because we see some of the people that objected to that, but it was a very good view of what Americans were like then. And so,
Yeah. So you had a question?
Yeah, I read a book, The Fish That Ate the Whale, about the banana industry. And you haven't mentioned much about it, but I love the book, and I was shocked to see how influential the United Fruit, and they set up colonies.
It's huge, yeah, but more in Central America than the Caribbean. So this is
Okay.
yeah. So,
but the point, I guess, is that I showed you the State Department, the War, and the Navy. There probably should be another one for the business interests.
right, yeah, sort of correlating this.
Because I track back, and sometimes I just find out where Marine Unit was, and I'd say, why is it here?
Right.
And if I go track it back far enough, it's somebody from the United Fruit Company somewhere saying, we need somebody to go protect our plantation, send some Marines. And that's
Yeah, and that was really intricate between the State Department and these people. Like when the State Department wanted information about a country, they would ask like United Fruit executives, or you know what I mean. Those were the people they talked to about the places. So you can get a sense of it.
Yeah, there's all that money, that money.
Yeah. I think we have to wrap up, but we can continue informally. But thank you so much for coming today.